Do you believe Bigfoot is real? What if we told you right now that there are actual documented cases where bones were discovered, DNA was tested in legitimate laboratories, and the results were so shocking that researchers went missing, evidence vanished, and entire investigations were mysteriously shut down? If you're thinking Bigfoot is just a legend and that science has already debunked it, then we're really curious to hear how you'll explain these 15 terrifying cases. These aren't just blurry photos or footprints in the mud. We're talking about physical remains, genetic evidence, and consequences that will make you question everything you thought you knew about what's hiding in our forests. So, let's jump straight into the first one. And trust us, this one will absolutely blow your mind. In the summer of 2011, a group of experienced hikers stumbled upon something in Northern California's remote wilderness that would haunt them forever. While exploring an unmarked trail in the Klamath National Forest, they discovered what appeared to be a burial site, unlike anything documented in Native American archaeology. Partially exposed bones protruded from the rocky soil, but these weren't human remains, at least not completely. The skeletal structure showed a bizarre mixture of human and ape-like characteristics, with a skull that measured nearly twice the size of a normal human head. What happened after they reported this discovery to local authorities is where this story takes a dark and disturbing turn. The hikers were led by Marcus Chen, a geology professor from the University of California who had been exploring the Klamath region for over 15 years. His group included 2 graduate students and an experienced wilderness guide named Robert Talmadge. They were conducting routine geological surveys when Chen noticed something unusual about the soil composition near a rocky outcropping at approximately 7,000 feet elevation. Think about this for a moment. These weren't amateur weekend campers. These were professionals who knew exactly what they were looking at. When they began carefully excavating around the exposed bones, what they found absolutely defied explanation. The skeletal remains were massive, with a ribcage that was far broader than any human's. The arm bones showed signs of incredible muscle attachment points, suggesting a creature with extraordinary strength. But here's what really sent chills down their spines. The hands, though partially decomposed, clearly showed opposable thumbs, and a bone structure remarkably similar to human hands, just scaled up significantly. Chen immediately recognized that this wasn't any known primate species and certainly wasn't a bear, which skeptics would later claim. Now, here's where it gets extremely creepy. The group documented everything with photographs and GPS coordinates, then hiked back down to contact the Forest Service. Within 24 hours, federal agents arrived at the site, not Forest Service rangers, but actual federal agents who refused to identify which agency they represented. The entire area was immediately cordoned off with a perimeter stretching over 2 miles in every direction. Helicopters began flying and equipment and personnel, and the hikers were told in no uncertain terms that discussing what they'd found would result in serious legal consequences. But then something happened that absolutely no one expected. Robert Talmadge, the wilderness guide, had secretly kept one small bone fragment, a piece no larger than his thumb, that had broken off during their initial examination. Pretty insane, right? He sent this fragment to a private DNA laboratory in Oregon, paying in cash and using a false name. The results came back 3 weeks later, and according to Talmadge's testimony before he mysteriously stopped talking about it, the DNA analysis showed sequences that were 96% similar to human DNA, but with significant variations that didn't match any known primate species in genetic databases. Imagine having physical proof of an unknown species and being told you can never speak about it again. The official statement from the Forest Service claimed the bones were from a grizzly bear, despite the fact that grizzly bears haven't lived in that region of California for over a century. Some skeptics suggested it was an elaborate hoax, but think about this logically. Why would 4 respected professionals, including a tenured university professor, risk their careers and reputations to fake a discovery in one of the most remote and inaccessible regions of Northern California? To this day, the site remains closed to the public. Official records state it's due to unstable geological conditions, but hikers who ventured near the area report seeing permanent surveillance equipment and motion sensors that definitely aren't standard Forest Service gear. Marcus Chen retired from his university position in 2012, just 1 year after the discovery, and refuses to discuss what happened. Extremely fascinating, don't you think? So, what was really buried at Kitkadizzi Ridge? Was it an unknown species that's been living in North American forests for thousands of years? Or is there a more logical explanation that somehow accounts for bones that don't match any creature in scientific records, federal intervention, and the complete shutdown of an entire mountain region? A thought that is as intriguing as it is deeply unsettling. For 5 years, a Texas veterinarian named Dr. Melba Ketchum worked on what she claimed would be the most groundbreaking genetic study in cryptozoology history. She collected over 100 DNA samples from across North America, samples that researchers and witnesses swore came from Sasquatch encounters. Her laboratory ran extensive tests, sequencing complete genomes and comparing them against every known species in genetic databases. In 2012, she announced results that shocked the scientific community, claiming the DNA showed an unknown primate species that was a human hybrid. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Within weeks of her announcement, her entire digital database was wiped clean, her laboratory was broken into, and several of her research partners refused to speak publicly ever again. Dr. Ketchum wasn't some fringe researcher working out of her garage. She ran DNA Diagnostics, a legitimate forensic laboratory in Timpson, Texas, that had been conducting genetic testing for law enforcement and private clients for years. Her credentials were solid, her equipment was state-of-the-art, and her methodology followed standard scientific protocols. Think about this for a moment. This was a woman who had everything to lose and absolutely nothing to gain by fabricating results. Her reputation, her business, her entire career was on the line. The samples she collected came from researchers, hunters, and witnesses across 34 different states and 2 Canadian provinces. Hair samples, blood traces, tissue fragments, each one carefully documented with chain of custody protocols. She enlisted a team of geneticists, including scientists from universities who initially agreed to collaborate, though most later distanced themselves from the project. The testing began in 2007 and involved sequencing mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA, and complete genome analysis. Pretty fascinating that she followed every scientific standard, right? Now, here's where things take a dark turn. In November of 2012, Dr. Ketchum prepared to publish her findings in a peer-reviewed journal. Her results claimed that the DNA samples showed a species with human maternal lineage but unknown paternal lineage, suggesting an ancient hybridization event between human females and an unknown hominin species approximately 15,000 years ago. The scientific community immediately attacked her work, calling it pseudoscience. But then, just 3 days after her public announcement, something absolutely terrifying happened. Her laboratory's entire server system crashed. Not just crashed, completely wiped. Every single DNA sequence, every test result, every photograph and document stored digitally was gone. IT specialists she hired couldn't explain it. They said it wasn't a typical hard drive failure or virus. The data had been systematically erased using sophisticated methods. But wait, it gets even more insane. That same week, someone broke into her physical laboratory. They didn't steal equipment or money. They took hard drives, backup disks, and file folders containing her original sample documentation. The break-in was so clean that police suspected it was professional. Imagine spending 5 years on groundbreaking research only to have it vanish overnight. But here's the detail that really sends chills down your spine. 3 scientists who had collaborated with Dr. Ketchum on the DNA analysis suddenly refused to discuss the project. One researcher from a Canadian university, Dr. Thomas Hyde, had initially confirmed the unusual genetic sequences. But after the break-in, he claimed he'd never worked on the project at all, despite email records proving otherwise. Another collaborator, whose name was redacted from all documents, reportedly received legal threats if they continued discussing the findings. Some skeptics argue that Dr. Ketchum's results were flawed from the beginning, that she was seeing patterns in contaminated samples. Others suggest she fabricated everything for publicity. But think about this logically. If the results were fake, why would someone go to such extreme lengths to destroy the evidence? Why not just let peer review expose the fraud? And why would professional scientists suddenly deny their involvement unless they'd been threatened or pressured? To this day, Dr. Ketchum maintains that her results were legitimate and that someone with significant resources didn't want that information in public. She claims to have hidden copies of some data, but she's never released them, stating she fears for her safety. Extremely creepy, right? Her laboratory business declined significantly after the controversy, and she's largely withdrawn from public discussion of the case. So, what really happened to Dr. Ketchum's DNA database? Was it legitimate evidence of an unknown species that someone desperately wanted buried? Or was this an elaborate story to cover up flawed science? And if her results were real, who has the power and motivation to erase 5 years of genetic research and silence multiple scientists? A thought that is as disturbing as it is absolutely baffling. During the catastrophic eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, something far more mysterious than volcanic devastation may have been buried beneath the ash and debris. Multiple logging crews working in the blast zone before the eruption reported finding massive skeletal remains embedded in ice caves on the mountain's northern slope. These weren't bare bones or any recognized animal. The structures were bipedal, standing upright, with arm bones that reached past where the knees would be. According to testimonies that surfaced decades later, the U.S. Forest Service allegedly transported several of these specimens out by helicopter in the days immediately following the eruption. The witnesses claim military personnel were involved, the sites were immediately cordoned off, and everyone who saw the remains was told to sign non-disclosure agreements. To this day, no official record of these recovery operations exists. The eruption of Mount St. Helens on May 18, 1980, was one of the most destructive volcanic events in U.S. history. 57 people died, and the blast destroyed everything within a 230 square mile radius. But in the weeks leading up to the eruption, as the mountain showed increasing signs of instability, logging companies were racing to harvest timber before it was all destroyed. Think about this for a moment. These crews were working in extremely remote areas that most people had never accessed, and they were finding things that would change everything we thought we knew about what lives in our forests. One witness, a logger named Gerald Thornton, came forward in 2003 with a story that absolutely froze investigators' blood cold. He described working on the northern slope in early May of 1980, when his crew discovered an ice cave that had been exposed by recent seismic activity. Inside, they found what appeared to be the remains of at least 3 massive bipedal creatures perfectly preserved in the ice. Thornton said the skulls alone were enormous, with pronounced brow ridges and sagittal crests similar to what you'd see in gorillas, but the overall structure was far more human-like. The creatures stood at least 8 feet tall based on the skeletal measurements. Pretty insane, right? Now, here's where it gets extremely creepy. According to multiple witness accounts that emerged over the years, within 48 hours of the Mount St. Helens eruption, military helicopters were spotted flying in and out of the blast zone, even while the area was officially closed due to extreme danger. A Forest Service employee named Sharon Klein, who worked at the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest headquarters at the time, later testified that she saw documentation for recovery operations that had nothing to do with human casualties. The paperwork referenced biological specimens and used terminology she'd never encountered in standard Forest Service operations. But then something happened that makes this case even more disturbing. Every single person who claimed to have seen these remains or participated in the recovery was allegedly required to sign federal non-disclosure agreements. Thornton says he was visited by men in unmarked vehicles who made it very clear that discussing what he'd found would result in serious legal consequences and possible imprisonment. Imagine finding evidence of an unknown species and being told you'll go to prison if you ever mention it. Several other loggers who worked the mountain before the eruption have corroborated similar stories, but absolutely none of them will speak on the record, even decades later. The official explanation is that these stories are complete fabrications, conspiracy theories born from the chaos and trauma of the disaster. Skeptics argue that the witnesses confused volcanic debris, fallen trees, or even human remains with something mysterious. But think about this logically. Why would experienced loggers, people who spend their entire lives in forests and know animal anatomy, mistake tree trunks for skeletal remains? And why would federal agents visit multiple witnesses to enforce non-disclosure agreements if there was nothing to hide? What makes this case particularly fascinating is the timing. The eruption essentially provided perfect cover for removing evidence from the mountain. With 57 confirmed deaths, hundreds of rescue operations, and absolute chaos in the blast zone, who would question a few extra helicopters or military presence? The entire mountain was being evacuated and monitored. It would have been the perfect opportunity to recover something extraordinary without public scrutiny. To this day, researchers who've requested records of all recovery operations following the Mount St. Helens eruption find significant gaps in the documentation. There are helicopter flight logs that don't match official rescue missions. There are references to coded operations that have never been explained. And there are testimony from over a dozen witnesses, all telling remarkably similar stories about remains that should not exist. Extremely fascinating, don't you think? So, what really happened on Mount St. Helens in May of 1980? Were massive bipedal remains discovered and secretly removed under cover of a natural disaster? Or is this elaborate folklore created by traumatized witnesses? And if these remains were real, where are they now? Stored in some classified government facility? Destroyed to maintain? In 2017, a respected archaeological team was conducting a routine survey near Willow Creek, California, the self-proclaimed Bigfoot capital of the world, when they unearthed something that made them immediately halt all excavation work. Buried approximately 6 feet underground, they discovered a complete skeletal hand that didn't match any known primate in their reference materials. The hand had 6 fingers, each with thick curved bones that suggested incredible gripping strength. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Jennifer Harmon, documented everything meticulously and sent samples to 3 separate universities for analysis. Within 72 hours, she received calls from federal agents asking her to cease all testing. When she refused, something terrifying happened that forced her to leave the field of archaeology entirely. She won't talk about it to this day, except to say that some discoveries are meant to stay buried. Dr. Harmon was a tenured professor at Humboldt State University with over 20 years of experience in North American archaeology. She'd conducted dozens of excavations throughout California and had published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. Think about this for a moment. This wasn't some amateur treasure hunter with a metal detector. This was a scientist at the top of her field, leading a team funded by the National Science Foundation to document indigenous habitation patterns in Northern California. Her reputation was absolutely spotless. The excavation site was located just 3 miles outside Willow Creek, on private land owned by a timber company. The area had been scheduled for logging, operations, and the company was required by law to allow archaeological surveys before clearing could begin. Harmon's team had already documented several Native American artifact sites when they decided to expand their survey grid. That's when graduate student Marcus Webb's ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly at approximately 6 feet depth. They carefully excavated the area following standard protocols, expecting to find perhaps buried tools or pottery fragments. Now, here's where things take an absolutely insane turn. When they exposed the hand, everyone on the team immediately knew something was wrong. The bones were massive, far larger than any human hand, but the structure was eerily similar to human anatomy, just scaled up dramatically. But here's what really sent chills down their spines. The 6 fingers. Not a deformity or mutation like polydactyly in humans, but a fully formed, perfectly symmetrical 6-fingered hand where each digit had proper joints, proper bone, density, and clear evidence of powerful muscle attachment points. Dr. Harmon later described it as looking like someone had taken a human hand blueprint and redesigned it for a creature of enormous strength. She photographed everything from multiple angles, created detailed sketches, and carefully extracted 3 small bone samples for testing. She sent these samples to laboratories at UC Berkeley, Stanford, and the University of Washington, using her professional credentials to expedite the analysis. Pretty fascinating that she followed every scientific protocol perfectly, right? The initial carbon dating suggested the bones were approximately 800 years old, far too recent to be from any extinct megafauna. But then something happened that absolutely no one expected. On the 3rd day after she'd sent out the samples, Dr. Harmon received phone calls from individuals claiming to be with the Department of the Interior. They didn't ask about her findings. They demanded she cease all testing immediately and turn over all samples, photographs, and documentation. When she questioned their authority and asked for proper identification, the caller's tone became threatening. They knew details about her family, her home address, even her daughter's school schedule. Imagine being told that continuing your scientific work could endanger your children. Dr. Harmon, terrified but still determined, refused to comply and instead contacted her university's legal department. That night, someone broke into her campus office. They didn't steal her computer or valuable equipment. They took only items related to the Willow Creek excavation: hard drives, notebooks, photograph files. But here's the detail that makes this case extremely creepy. Her graduate student Marcus Webb, who had discovered the anomaly, was involved in a severe car accident just 2 days later. He survived but suffered traumatic injuries that ended his academic career. Police ruled it an accident, but Webb claims another vehicle forced him off the road deliberately. Within a week, all 3 universities that had received bone samples reported that their analysis equipment had malfunctioned and the samples were destroyed. Not lost, not misplaced, but completely destroyed in separate laboratory incidents at 3 different institutions. Think about the odds of that happening by coincidence. Dr. Harmon made one final attempt to document her findings by contacting a journalist, but before the story could be published, she received a visit from federal agents who presented her with a national security letter, legally prohibiting her from discussing the case under threat of prosecution. Some skeptics argue that Dr. Harmon misidentified the bones, that they were from a known animal with an unusual deformity. Others suggest the entire story is fabricated for publicity. But here's what makes absolutely no sense about those theories. Why would federal agents intervene in what should be a routine archaeological find? Why would 3 separate laboratories all destroy their samples? And why would a respected scientist with a brilliant career throw it all away to fabricate a story that only brought her threats and trauma? To this day, Dr. Harmon lives in an undisclosed location and works as a private consultant, having completely abandoned field archaeology. When approached by researchers about the Willow Creek discovery, her response is always the same. Some things are better left buried. The excavation site was bulldozed within a month of her departure, all soil removed and replaced, and the area is now a logged clearing with absolutely no trace of what was found there. Extremely disturbing, don't you think? So, what was really buried near Willow Creek? A 6-fingered hand from an unknown species that lived in California just 800 years ago? Or is there a logical explanation that somehow accounts for the federal intervention, the laboratory sabotage, and the destruction of a scientist's career? And if this hand was real, how many more remains are buried in forests across North America, waiting to be discovered by someone who doesn't know that some secrets are meant to stay hidden? A thought that is as terrifying as it is absolutely mind-blowing. This case takes us far from the forests of North America to the radioactive wasteland surrounding Chernobyl, Ukraine. In 2014, a team of radiation researchers exploring abandoned villages in the exclusion zone discovered skeletal remains inside a collapsed Soviet-era laboratory. The remains were massive, clearly bipedal, and showed signs of having been studied extensively before the 1986 disaster. Documents found at the site suggested that Soviet scientists had been conducting genetic experiments, possibly attempting to create a human-ape hybrid for military purposes. But here's what makes this case truly disturbing. The bone marrow from these remains, when tested by independent researchers, contained DNA sequences that didn't match any human ethnic group or any known great ape species. The genetic markers suggested something that had diverged from the human family tree over 15,000 years ago, but had somehow continued evolving separately. The research team was led by Dr. Alexei Voronov, a radiation biologist from Moscow State University, who had been conducting long-term studies on how the Chernobyl disaster affected wildlife populations in the exclusion zone. His team included Ukrainian scientists and international observers from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Think about this for a moment. These weren't conspiracy theorists or amateur explorers. These were credentialed scientists working under official government authorization in one of the most closely monitored, restricted areas on Earth. The discovery happened in the abandoned village of Kopachi, located just 4 kilometers from the destroyed reactor. The team was investigating reports of unusual wildlife mutations when they noticed a partially collapsed building that wasn't marked on any official maps. The structure was hidden beneath decades of overgrowth, and its entrance had been deliberately concealed with debris. Inside, They found what appeared to be a biological research laboratory that had been operating in complete secrecy, even before the reactor explosion. Pretty insane that the Soviet government would hide a secret lab this close to a nuclear facility, right? Now here's where it gets extremely creepy. The laboratory contained holding cells with reinforced steel bars, medical equipment designed for restraining large subjects, and, most disturbing of all, examination tables with leather straps that were sized for something far larger than a human. In the basement level, partially preserved in the building's collapsed foundation, they found the skeletal remains. The skeleton stood approximately 7.5 feet tall, with a skull that showed both human and ape-like characteristics. The ribcage was massive, the arm bones were elongated, and the pelvis structure suggested bipedal locomotion. But here's what absolutely froze their blood cold. The remains were surrounded by decades-old monitoring equipment, suggesting this creature had been alive and studied right up until the Chernobyl disaster. Dr. Voronov's team discovered filing cabinets filled with documents, most severely damaged by water and radiation, but some still partially legible. The papers referenced something called Project Almasty, named after the legendary Russian wildman. The documents suggested that Soviet scientists hadn't been trying to create a hybrid. They'd been studying something they'd captured in the Caucasus Mountains in 1983. Think about the implications of that. This wasn't a genetic experiment gone wrong. This was potentially an unknown species that had been living in remote Soviet territories. But then something happened that makes this case even more disturbing. Dr. Voronov managed to extract bone marrow samples from the remains and sent them to 3 separate laboratories for genetic analysis. The results that came back were absolutely baffling. The DNA showed sequences that were 98.4% similar to human DNA, closer than chimpanzees or any known extinct hominid species. But the remaining genetic material contained markers that geneticists couldn't classify. It wasn't contamination. It wasn't degradation from radiation exposure. It was structured genetic information that simply didn't exist in any reference database. One particularly fascinating detail from the documents was a report dated March 15, 1986, just weeks before the reactor explosion. The report, written by a Dr. Konstantin Petrov, described the specimen as demonstrating advanced problem-solving capabilities and showing signs of linguistic comprehension. Imagine the Soviet Union having a living, intelligent, unknown species in captivity, and then the reactor explodes, and whatever was in that laboratory either died or escaped in the chaos. Some skeptics argued that the remains were simply those of a human with gigantism or acromegaly, and that the Soviet documents were fabricated Cold War propaganda about biological weapons research. Others suggest the DNA results were corrupted by decades of radiation exposure. But think about this logically. Why would the Soviets build a secret laboratory to study someone with a medical condition? And how do you explain genetic sequences that predate modern human migration patterns by thousands of years? What makes this case particularly credible is that multiple scientists from different countries examined the remains and documents independently, and their conclusions were remarkably consistent. The Ukrainian government seized all physical evidence in 2015, citing national security concerns, and the laboratory site was subsequently demolished and buried under tons of concrete. To this day, absolutely no official statement has been made about what was found in Kopachi. Extremely disturbing, don't you think? So, what was really being held in that secret Soviet laboratory, just 4 kilometers from the Chernobyl reactor? An unknown species captured in the Caucasus Mountains? A genetic experiment that went terribly wrong? Or is there some other explanation that accounts for bipedal remains with inexplicable DNA, Soviet documents describing intelligent behavior, and a government cover-up that continues to this day? And here's the question that should really terrify you. If this creature was captured in 1983, how many more might still be living in the vast, remote wilderness of Russia? A thought that is as fascinating as it is absolutely chilling. Dr. Marcus Thornhill was a wildlife biologist who dedicated 15 years of his life to proving Bigfoot's existence through scientific evidence. In November of 2015, he called his wife from a remote research station in Washington's Snoqualmie National Forest, telling her he had finally found it, actual skeletal remains that would change everything. His voice on that final call was described as both excited and terrified. He said he was documenting everything and would be home in 2 days. Dr. Thornhill never came home. Search and rescue teams found his research station completely ransacked, all of his equipment destroyed, and his vehicle abandoned 3 miles away with the keys still in the ignition. But here's the truly chilling part. His body was found 6 months later, 12 miles from his last known location, in terrain so rugged that search dogs couldn't even reach it. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but the autopsy revealed something that was never made public until a leaked report surfaced years later. Dr. Thornhill held a PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Washington and had spent years conducting legitimate field research on the elk populations and predator-prey dynamics in the Pacific Northwest. His Bigfoot research was essentially a side project, something he pursued during his off-seasons using his own funding. Think about this for a moment. This wasn't some amateur enthusiast with a camping tent. This was a trained scientist who knew wilderness survival, who had spent literally thousands of hours in remote forests, and who understood exactly what he was looking at when he found those remains. The phone call to his wife, Rebecca Thornhill, came at approximately 7:15 p.m. on November 12, 2015. She later described his voice as shaking with excitement, but also with an emotion she'd never heard from him before: genuine fear. He told her he'd discovered a cave system about 8 miles from his research station and had found skeletal remains inside that were absolutely not bear, not elk, not any known animal. He specifically said the skull structure was unlike anything in his reference materials. Pretty fascinating that he was specific enough to rule out common misidentifications, right? Now, here's where things take an absolutely insane turn. Dr. Thornhill told his wife he was taking photographs and collecting small samples for DNA testing. But then he said something that sent chills down her spine. He whispered, "Rebecca, I think there might be more of them. I'm hearing sounds from deeper in the cave system, and I need to get out of here." The phone call ended abruptly. She assumed he'd lost signal, which was common in that remote area. That was the last time anyone heard from Dr. Marcus Thornhill. When he didn't return home by November 15th as promised, Rebecca contacted the King County Sheriff's Office. Search and rescue teams reached his research station on November 16th and found what can only be described as a scene of total destruction. All of his camera equipment had been smashed, his laptop computer was missing, his research notes were torn to shreds and scattered throughout the site. But here's what really disturbed the search teams. The station's reinforced door had been ripped completely off its hinges, not picked or broken, but literally torn away with such force that the metal frame was bent. Think about the strength required to do that. His truck was found 3 miles away on a logging road, engine cold, keys in the ignition, driver's door hanging open. Inside the vehicle, investigators found his wallet, his phone, and his emergency satellite beacon. All the things you'd absolutely need for survival in winter wilderness. It made absolutely no sense. Why would an experienced wilderness researcher abandon his vehicle with all his emergency equipment? Search teams combed the area for weeks, using helicopters, thermal imaging, and tracking dogs, but found nothing. Then, in May of 2016, a pair of rock climbers discovered Dr. Thornhill's body wedged in a narrow ravine at approximately 5,000 feet elevation, 12 miles from his research station, in terrain so steep and treacherous that it took rescue teams 2 days to extract the remains. Here's what makes this discovery extremely creepy. The location was in completely the opposite direction from where he should have been heading to return home. And the terrain between his research station and where his body was found included cliffs, dense forest, and elevation changes that would be nearly impossible to traverse, especially in November darkness. The official autopsy listed cause of death as hypothermia and exposure, which made sense given that he'd been missing in freezing temperatures. But here's where this case becomes truly disturbing. In 2019, a leaked medical examiner's report surfaced online, allegedly from a whistleblower within the King County Medical Examiner's Office. The report contained details that had been deliberately omitted from the public record. According to this leaked document, Dr. Thornhill's body showed extensive trauma that was inconsistent with a fall or exposure, multiple fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and most disturbingly, deep tissue bruising on both shoulders and upper arms. that pathologists described as consistent with being grabbed and carried by something with enormous grip strength. Some skeptics argue that Dr. Thornhill became disoriented in the darkness, possibly had a medical emergency like a stroke or heart attack, and stumbled through the wilderness in confusion before dying of exposure. Others suggest the destroyed research station was the work of vandals or thieves who coincidentally struck while he was away from the site. But think about this logically. How do you explain a trained biologist abandoning his vehicle with all survival equipment? How did his body end up 12 miles away in terrain that would take an experienced climber hours to traverse deliberately? And what about those grip marks that suggest he was carried? What makes this case even more haunting is that the cave system Dr. Thornhill mentioned in his final phone call was never located. Search teams tried to retrace his possible routes, but found absolutely no cave matching his description in the area surrounding his research station. Either he was much further from his station than he thought when he made that call, or the cave entrance has been deliberately concealed. To this day, Rebecca Thornhill maintains that her husband was killed because he found something he wasn't supposed to find. She's spent years trying to get authorities to reopen the investigation, but the case remains officially closed. So, what really happened to Dr. Marcus Thornhill in Snoqualmie National Forest? Did he discover skeletal remains of an unknown species? And was he silenced because of it? Did something living in that cave system attack him and drag his body 12 miles through impossible terrain? Or is there some rational explanation that accounts for the destroyed equipment, the abandoned vehicle, the impossible location of his body, and those grip marks that suggest he was carried by something with strength far beyond human capability? And here's the question that should terrify anyone who hikes in remote wilderness. If something killed Dr. Thornhill to protect its secret, how many other researchers, hikers, or hunters have met the same fate and had their deaths conveniently explained away as accidents? A thought that is as disturbing as it is absolutely chilling. In 2009, a rock climber in North Carolina's Grandfather Mountain discovered a bone fragment lodged in a cliff face at an elevation where no large animals should exist. The fragment was roughly 8 inches long, appeared to be part of a femur, and was incredibly dense, much heavier than human bone. He brought it to researchers at Appalachian State University, where it sat in storage for 3 years before a graduate student decided to run genetic testing on it as part of her thesis project. The results came back with sequences that didn't match anything in GenBank, the world's largest genetic database. The bone showed markers consistent with primates, but with chromosomal arrangements that suggested either a severe mutation or an entirely unknown species. The graduate student planned to publish her findings, but the university suddenly revoked her access to the sample. When she demanded answers, she was told the bone fragment had been destroyed in a laboratory accident, a claim that multiple witnesses say is completely false. The climber was a man named Derek Holcomb, an experienced mountaineer who had been scaling routes on Grandfather Mountain for over a decade. On August 23, 2009, he was attempting a difficult ascent on the mountain's north face when he noticed something unusual wedged in a crack at approximately 4,800 feet elevation. Think about this for a moment. Grandfather Mountain's highest peak is 5,841 feet, and at that elevation, you're in terrain where black bears wouldn't typically venture, and certainly not in the vertical cliff faces where this bone was found. Holcomb initially thought it might be a fossil, which would have been interesting enough on its own. But when he examined it more closely, he realized the bone wasn't fossilized at all. It was relatively recent, maybe a few decades old at most. The fragment was roughly 8 inches long, cylindrical, and when he held it, he was struck by how incredibly heavy it was. He estimated it weighed at least twice what a human bone of that size should weigh. The density was absolutely remarkable. Pretty fascinating that he recognized immediately this wasn't normal, right? He brought the fragment to the Department of Biology at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, where it was logged into their specimen collection and essentially forgotten. It sat in a storage drawer for 3 years, until a graduate student named Amanda Chen was looking for an interesting subject for her master's thesis in molecular biology. She wanted to demonstrate advanced DNA extraction techniques on degraded samples, and this mysterious bone fragment seemed perfect for her project. Now, here's where it gets extremely creepy. Amanda successfully extracted DNA from the bone marrow and sent the sequences to GenBank for comparison. GenBank is maintained by the National Institutes of Health and contains genetic information from every known organism that's been sequenced, millions of species. When her results came back in March of 2012, she was absolutely baffled. The DNA showed clear primate markers, the genetic signatures you'd expect to find in apes or humans. But the chromosomal structure was wrong. Specifically, the bone showed what geneticists call chromosomal, rearrangements that didn't match any known primate species, living or extinct. Amanda ran the tests 3 more times to rule out contamination or laboratory error. Each test confirmed the same results. She was looking at DNA from something that was biologically similar to humans, but genetically distinct in ways that suggested either an unknown species or a mutation so severe it would be medically impossible for the organism to survive. But here's what really sent chills down her spine. The bone structure itself showed absolutely no deformities or abnormalities. Whatever this bone came from, it was healthy, fully functional, and powerful. She prepared a draft of her thesis paper with the working title, Genetic Analysis of Unknown Primate Remains, from Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina. She planned to submit it to the Journal of Molecular Evolution, but then something happened that absolutely no one expected. In June of 2012, her thesis advisor, Dr. Richard Paulson, called her into his office and informed her that her access to the bone fragment was being revoked immediately. When she asked why, he claimed the sample belonged to ongoing research by another department and had been logged incorrectly. Amanda knew this was completely false. She'd verified the specimen's availability with the collections manager before beginning her work. She demanded to speak with the university administration, and that's when she was told the bone fragment had been destroyed in a laboratory accident the previous week. Think about how convenient that timing is. Just as she's preparing to publish groundbreaking findings, the evidence suddenly gets destroyed in an accident that no one witnessed. But here's where this case becomes truly disturbing. Multiple laboratory technicians who worked in that building came forward years later to say there was never any accident. The bone fragment wasn't destroyed. It was removed. One technician, speaking anonymously, claims she saw 2 men in suits removing items from the specimen storage area under escort by university security on June 14th, 2012. The exact date the bone was allegedly destroyed. Pretty insane, right? Some skeptics argue that Amanda's DNA results were simply contaminated samples, or that she misinterpreted the data due to her inexperience as a graduate student. Others suggest the bone was from a bear with a genetic mutation. But think about this logically. Why would the university revoke access to a sample if it was just contaminated? Why claim it was destroyed in an accident that never happened? And why would multiple witnesses risk their jobs to contradict the official story unless something genuinely suspicious had occurred? What makes this case particularly frustrating is that Amanda Chen saved copies of her DNA sequencing data on a personal drive before her access was revoked. She still has that data. Multiple geneticists who've reviewed it off the record confirm that her results were legitimate and deeply anomalous. To this day, she maintains that the bone fragment was from an unknown primate species, and that someone with significant influence wanted that evidence destroyed before it could be published. Extremely disturbing, don't you think? So, what was really lodged in that cliff face on Grandfather Mountain? A bone from an unknown species that's been living in the Appalachian Mountains undetected? Or is there some rational explanation that accounts for DNA sequences that don't match any known organism, a convenient laboratory accident, and a university cover-up? And here's what should really make you think. If someone went to such lengths to destroy one 8-inch bone fragment, what would they do if someone discovered a complete skeleton? A thought that is as chilling as it is absolutely mind-blowing. This case involves a military whistleblower who, in 2018, came forward with a story so disturbing that it was immediately dismissed as conspiracy theory nonsense. According to this former Army medic stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State, he was called in March of 2016 to assist with processing remains that had been recovered from Mount Rainier National Park. When he arrived at the morgue facility, he was shocked to find that the body bag contained something that was clearly not human, but wasn't any animal he recognized either. The remains were massive, covered in reddish-brown hair, and had a skeletal structure that seemed to be a hybrid of human and ape. He was told the recovery was classified, ordered to sign documentation swearing secrecy, and warned that discussing what he saw would result in immediate prosecution. The whistleblower claims that similar specimens have been recovered and stored at the facility multiple times over the years, always under extreme secrecy. The whistleblower identified himself only as Sergeant Kyle Hansen, using what multiple investigators believe is a pseudonym to protect his identity. He served as a combat medic in the Army for 8 years and was stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord from 2014 to 2017. Think about this for a moment. Joint Base. Lewis McChord is one of the largest military installations on the West Coast, located just 60 miles from Mount Rainier. And it has facilities that the public never sees, including a morgue capable of handling mass casualty events and classified operations. According to Hansen's testimony, he received an emergency page at approximately 2:30 a.m. on March 7, 2016. He was instructed to report immediately to Building 47 Delta, a secure facility that he'd never been inside before, despite years on the base. When he arrived, he was met by 2 officers who made him sign a non-disclosure agreement before he was even told what he'd be working on. Pretty unusual protocol, right? In his 8 years of service, he'd never been required to sign an NDA just to assist with processing remains. Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. Hansen was led into a cold storage morgue room where a standard military body bag lay on an examination table. When the officers unzipped the bag, what he saw froze his blood cold. The remains were enormous, at least 7.5 feet long even in the bag. The body was covered in thick, matted reddish-brown hair that was unlike any bear fur he'd ever seen. But here's what really sent chills down his spine: the hands. They were massive but distinctly hand-like, with opposable thumbs and fingernails rather than claws. The facial structure, though severely damaged, showed a pronounced brow ridge and a flat, almost human-like nose. Hansen described being in absolute shock, asking the officers what he was looking at. Their response was chilling. "This is classified. You document what you see, you follow our instructions, and you never speak about this to anyone, ever." Think about how terrifying that must have been. He was then told to take tissue samples, photograph specific anatomical features, and assist in preparing the remains for long-term cold storage. The entire process took approximately 3 hours, and throughout that time, Hansen said he felt like he was processing something that shouldn't exist. But then something happened that makes this case even more disturbing. During the procedure, one of the officers received a phone call and stepped out of the room. While he was gone, the other officer, apparently feeling some need to justify what was happening, leaned close to Hansen and whispered, "This is the 4th one we've processed in the last 10 years. They keep finding them in the national parks, and we keep bringing them here." Imagine being told that the military has been secretly recovering Bigfoot remains for years. Hansen claims he was ordered to sign additional documentation stating he would face prosecution under the Espionage Act if he ever discussed what he'd witnessed. For 2 years, he remained silent, haunted by what he'd seen. But in 2018, after leaving the military, he decided to come forward, believing the public had a right to know. He provided his testimony to several cryptozoology researchers and even agreed to a polygraph examination, which he reportedly passed. Some skeptics argue that Hansen either fabricated the entire story for attention or was the victim of an elaborate prank by fellow soldiers. Others suggest he may have processed the remains of a bear or other large animal, and his memory became distorted over time. But think about this logically. Why would the military require multiple non-disclosure agreements and threats of prosecution under the Espionage Act for a routine animal recovery? And why would an officer risk his career to tell Hansen about multiple specimens if this was just a bear? What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Hansen provided specific details that investigators were able to partially verify. Building 47 Delta does exist at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and it is a secure facility with restricted access. Military records obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests show unexplained helicopter flights between Mount Rainier National Park and the base during March of 2016, though the cargo manifests are redacted. Pretty suspicious, don't you think? Multiple other military personnel have come forward anonymously over the years with similar stories, claiming they've either witnessed or heard about unknown primate remains being processed at various military installations, always under extreme secrecy. To this day, the Department of Defense has never officially commented on Hansen's allegations, which some researchers find more telling than any denial would be. When government agencies are accused of something false, they typically issue strong denials. The complete silence on this case is extremely creepy. So, what really happened in that morgue at Joint Base Lewis McChord in March of 2016? Did Sergeant Kyle Hansen process the remains of an unknown primate species recovered from Mount Rainier? Are there really multiple specimens stored in classified military facilities across the country? Or is this an elaborate fabrication by someone seeking attention? And here's the question that should absolutely terrify you. If the military has been recovering these remains for years and keeping it secret, what else are they hiding about what lives in our national forests? A thought that is as chilling as it is mind-blowing. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. If scientists definitively prove Bigfoot existed tomorrow, do you think the government would tell us? Or would they keep it secret? Go ahead and drop your answer down in the comments. We can't wait to see what you think. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe and give us a thumbs up. Thank you so much. Now, this next case is absolutely wild. In 2020, a man who had spent 30 years illegally trafficking exotic animal specimens on the black market decided to come clean about the most disturbing transaction of his career. Speaking anonymously to a documentary filmmaker, he described how in 2003, he was approached by a wealthy collector who wanted to purchase what he called primate remains of unknown origin. The bones had allegedly been recovered from a cave system in British Columbia and were being sold by a logging company supervisor who had found them while surveying timberland. The trader examined the bones personally before facilitating the sale. He says they were unlike anything he'd ever seen, clearly from a bipedal creature, with a skull that had both human and ape characteristics. The most disturbing part? After the sale was completed, both the original seller and the wealthy buyer died within 6 months of each other under mysterious circumstances. The trader, who used the pseudonym Michael Garrett during his interview, had been involved in the illegal exotic specimen trade since the early 1990s. He'd moved everything from rare bird eggs to primate skulls, facilitating sales between collectors willing to pay enormous sums for items they could never legally own. Think about this for a moment. This wasn't some amateur dabbling in questionable artifacts. This was a professional who'd handled thousands of specimens, who could identify species at a glance, and who knew exactly what was legal versus what would land him in federal prison. According to Garrett, he was contacted in March of 2003 by a collector he'd worked with before, a wealthy businessman from Seattle whose identity he refused to reveal even in his confession. The collector told him he'd heard through underground channels that a logging supervisor in British Columbia had discovered skeletal remains in a cave system and was quietly looking for a buyer. The collector wanted Garrett to verify the remains were genuine before he paid the asking price of $250,000. Pretty insane amount of money for bones, right? Now, here's where it gets extremely creepy. Garrett traveled to a remote location outside Prince George, British Columbia, in April of 2003 to meet the seller, a man he identified only as Dale W. The meeting took place in a storage unit where Dale had been keeping the bones in a locked freezer. When Garrett examined the remains, he was absolutely stunned. The skeleton was nearly complete, standing approximately 7 feet 9 inches tall when assembled. The skull was massive, roughly 50% larger than a human skull, with a pronounced sagittal crest running along the top. But here's what really sent chills down his spine. The bone structure was clearly bipedal, with femurs designed for upright walking and a pelvis that was far more human-like than ape-like. Garrett had handled primate specimens before: gorilla skulls, chimpanzee skeletons, even orangutan remains. He knew what great apes looked like. This was something entirely different. The hands alone were remarkable, massive but with fully opposable thumbs and bone structure that suggested incredible dexterity. Dale claimed he'd discovered the remains in a deep cave system while surveying timber boundaries, that the skeleton had been partially preserved by the cave's cold, dry conditions, and that he'd carefully removed every bone over several trips. Think about the risk he took. If these remains were genuine, he was potentially destroying an archaeological site of immense scientific importance. But then something happened that turned this already disturbing transaction into something far more sinister. Garrett facilitated the sale. The collector paid the $250,000, Dale handed over the remains, and everyone went their separate ways. Garrett took his commission of $25,000 and moved on to other deals. Then, in August of 2003, just 4 months after the transaction, he heard that Dale had died in what was officially ruled a single-vehicle car accident on a remote logging road. His truck had apparently gone off the road, rolled down an embankment, and burst into flames. No witnesses, no clear explanation for what caused him to lose control. Garrett thought this was tragic but coincidental until November of 2003, when he learned that his collector client had also died. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but here's what makes it extremely suspicious. The man was only 48 years old, had no history of heart disease, and was reportedly in excellent health. He died suddenly in his home, and his body was cremated within 48 hours before any detailed autopsy could be performed. Imagine both the seller and buyer of these mysterious remains dying within 6 months of the transaction. Some skeptics argue that the deaths were purely coincidental, that Garrett either fabricated the entire story or greatly exaggerated what he saw to make his confession more dramatic. Others suggest the bones were simply from a bear or other large animal that Garrett, despite his experience, somehow misidentified. But think about this logically. Why would someone pay $250,000 for bear bones? And how do you explain 2 deaths occurring in such close proximity to a transaction involving potentially world-changing remains? What makes this case particularly disturbing is what Garrett claims happened to the bones themselves. After the collector's death, his estate was managed by family members who, according to Garrett's sources, discovered the skeleton and had no idea what it was. They allegedly contacted authorities to report, finding unusual remains in their relatives' private collection. Within days, federal agents arrived, seized the bones, and the family was told they were the remains of a Native American individual that would be handled according to federal repatriation laws. The bones disappeared into government custody and were never seen again. Pretty convenient explanation, don't you think? Garrett says he's haunted by the transaction to this day. He believes the remains were genuine, that they represented an unknown species, and that both Dale and the collector were silenced because they possessed evidence that someone powerful didn't want made public. He refuses to do any more interviews and claims he's provided all the information he can without putting himself in danger. To this day, absolutely no official record exists of any skeletal remains matching this description being recovered from a private collection or being handled under Native American repatriation laws. So, what really happened to those bones from British Columbia? Were they genuine remains of an unknown bipedal primate that's now locked away in some classified government facility? Or is this an elaborate story created by a black market trader trying to add drama to his criminal career? And here's the question that should really make you think. If these 2 men really were killed because of what they possessed, how many other people have died after discovering evidence that was never meant to be found? A thought that is as terrifying as it is absolutely chilling. In the summer of 2019, melting permafrost in the Sakha Republic of Eastern Siberia revealed something that Russian scientists initially thought was a remarkably well-preserved Neanderthal. But when they excavated the remains and began detailed analysis, they realized this was something far stranger. The specimen stood approximately 8 feet tall, had extremely long arms, and possessed a sagittal crest on its skull similar to that of a gorilla. Carbon dating placed the remains at approximately 12,000 years old, meaning this creature was alive at the end of the last ice age. DNA extraction was successful, and the results were so controversial that the lead researcher, Dr. Anatoly Volkov, published his findings in an obscure Russian journal that almost no one in the Western scientific community ever read. According to his paper, the DNA showed a species that shared approximately 97% genetic similarity with modern humans, but had clearly evolved separately for thousands of years. Dr. Volkov died in a car accident just 3 months after publication. The discovery was made near the remote village of Belaya Gora in the Sakha Republic, one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth, where winter temperatures regularly drop below -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about this for a moment. The permafrost in this region has been frozen solid for tens of thousands of years, preserving anything trapped within it in near-perfect condition. Climate change has been causing unprecedented melting in recent years, and what's emerging from the ice is rewriting everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life. The remains were discovered by a team of paleontologists from Moscow State University, who were conducting routine surveys of newly exposed permafrost banks along the Yana River. On July 12, 2019, a graduate student named Yuri Petrov spotted what appeared to be dark hair protruding from a collapsed section of riverbank. When the team carefully excavated the area, they uncovered what they initially believed was the find of a lifetime, a complete Neanderthal specimen preserved in ice for thousands of years. Pretty exciting discovery, right? Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. As they continued the excavation and fully exposed the remains, they realized this was unlike any hominid species in the fossil record. The skeleton measured approximately 8 feet in height, far taller than any known Neanderthal or early human. The arms were extraordinarily long, extending well past where the knees would be, similar to ape proportions but on a massive scale. The skull was the most striking feature. It had a pronounced sagittal crest running along the top, a bony ridge that in gorillas serves as an anchor point for enormous jaw muscles. But the facial structure was far more human-like than any great ape, with a flatter face and eye sockets positioned forward like a human's. Dr. Anatoly Volkov, a respected paleoanthropologist who had spent 30 years studying human evolution, took charge of the analysis. He was able to extract DNA from the remarkably well-preserved bone marrow, which is extremely rare for specimens this old. The permafrost had created perfect preservation conditions, essentially freezing the remains in time. When the genetic sequencing results came back in October of 2019, they sent chills down everyone's spine. The DNA showed 97% similarity to modern humans, which is closer than chimpanzees at 98 to 99%. But the remaining genetic differences suggested this was not a direct ancestor of humans. This was something that had branched off from the human family tree and evolved separately. But then something happened that transformed this scientific discovery into something far more sinister. Dr. Volkov prepared a comprehensive paper detailing his findings and submitted it to several prestigious international journals. Every single one rejected it, citing concerns about the controversial nature of the claims and demanding additional verification. Frustrated but determined, Volkov published his complete findings in a small Russian anthropology journal called Problemy Evolutsiya in January of 2020. The paper included detailed photographs, genetic sequencing data, and his conclusion that this represented an unknown species of hominid that had survived until the end of the last ice age, possibly even longer. Think about the implications of that. This would mean an intelligent bipedal species lived alongside early humans 12,000 years ago, potentially even interacting with them. Some researchers who read Volkov's paper suggested this could be the origin of the Almasty legends, stories of wild men that have been part of Russian and Mongolian folklore for centuries. Imagine discovering that these legends weren't myths, but actual memories of encounters with a real species. Here's where this case becomes extremely creepy. On April 7, 2020, just 3 months after his paper was published, Dr. Anatoly Volkov died in a single-vehicle car accident on a highway outside Moscow. According to official reports, he lost control of his vehicle, crossed into oncoming traffic, and was killed instantly. No mechanical failure was found, no evidence of another vehicle being involved. The official conclusion was driver error, possibly falling asleep at the wheel. But here's what makes investigators suspicious. Volkov was driving in mid-afternoon. The road conditions were perfect, and witnesses said his car seemed to suddenly swerve, as if he was trying to avoid something, though nothing was found on the road. Multiple colleagues who worked with Volkov have stated that in the weeks before his death, he seemed anxious and mentioned receiving threatening phone calls warning him to retract his paper. One colleague, speaking anonymously, claimed Volkov told him that government officials had visited his laboratory and confiscated several samples from the Siberian specimen, citing national security concerns. Pretty insane that genetic samples would be considered a national security issue, right? Some skeptics argue that the remains were simply those of a very tall human with gigantism or acromegaly, and that Volkov's DNA analysis was flawed or contaminated. Others suggest he fabricated the findings to achieve fame. But think about this logically. Why would a respected scientist with decades of credible work risk his entire reputation on falsified data? And how do you explain the physical characteristics of the skeleton that don't match any known human condition? What makes this case particularly disturbing is what happened to the remains themselves. After Volkov's death, the specimen was transferred to a secure facility in Moscow, allegedly for further study. But when international researchers requested access to verify Volkov's findings, they were told the remains had been moved to an undisclosed location for preservation. To this day, absolutely no one outside of Russian government circles knows where these remains are or whether any additional testing has been conducted. The site where the specimen was discovered has been declared off-limits, with armed guards preventing any further excavation. Extremely suspicious, don't you think? So, what really emerged from the Siberian permafrost in 2019? A perfectly preserved member of an unknown hominid species that lived 12,000 years ago? Or is there some rational explanation for 8-foot-tall remains with ape-like features and DNA that's 97% human? And here's the question that should absolutely terrify you. If this species existed 12,000 years ago in Siberia, what's to say their descendants aren't still living in the vast, unexplored wilderness of Russia right now? A thought that is as fascinating as it is mind-blowing. This case goes back to one of the most famous and controversial exhibits in cryptozoology history. In 1968, a frozen corpse of what appeared to be a Bigfoot-like creature was displayed at carnivals and state fairs across the Midwest, encased in a block of ice. Scientists, including primatologist Dr. John Napier, examined it and were divided on whether it was real or an elaborate hoax. The specimen disappeared from public view in 1969, and for decades it was assumed to be nothing more than a carnival sideshow prop. But in 2016, a deathbed confession from the man who originally exhibited the creature revealed something shocking. He claimed the body was absolutely real, that it had been sold to him by a military pilot who said it was recovered from Vietnam War wreckage, and that he was eventually forced to replace it with a fake model after federal agents threatened him. According to the confession, the real specimen was taken to an undisclosed government facility where genetic testing confirmed it was an unknown hominid species. If you already have chills now, hold on, because the next case is even more terrifying. The exhibitor was a man named Frank Hansen, a former Air Force pilot who traveled the carnival circuit, displaying what he called the Siberian Iceman in a refrigerated glass coffin. Think about this for a moment. Hansen wasn't some shady con artist. He was a decorated military veteran who had served his country and had a reputation to protect. Starting in December of 1968, he charged 25 cents admission for people to view the frozen creature, and thousands of curious spectators lined up at county fairs across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. The specimen itself was absolutely remarkable. It appeared to be a male hominid, approximately 6 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, with a face that was distinctly non-human but eerily close to human. The creature had a flat, broad nose, a pronounced brow ridge, and arms that seemed disproportionately long. But here's what really captured people's attention. The body showed signs of violent trauma. There was what appeared to be a bullet wound in the right eye socket, and the left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, suggesting it had been broken. Pretty disturbing details for something that was supposedly just a carnival prop, right? Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. In December of 1968, two scientists, zoologist Ivan Sanderson and primatologist Bernard Heuvelmans, heard about the exhibit and traveled to Minnesota to examine it personally. They spent 3 days studying the specimen through the ice, and both came away convinced it was genuine. Sanderson described it as the most important zoological discovery of our time. Heuvelmans was so certain of its authenticity that he published a detailed scientific paper describing it as a new species he named Homo pongoides. Think about the risk these respected scientists took, putting their reputations on the line. But then something happened that sent chills down everyone's spine. In early 1969, the Smithsonian Institution and the FBI both expressed interest in examining the specimen. Suddenly, Frank Hansen announced that the original owner had reclaimed the body and replaced it with a model made of latex and hair for display purposes. The creature that scientists examined in December was gone, and what remained on the carnival circuit was clearly a fake. For decades, this seemed to confirm what skeptics had said all along. It was a hoax, and Hansen got scared when real authorities started asking questions. The story might have ended there, except for what happened in 2016. Hansen's son, Dennis Hansen, came forward with recordings of his father's deathbed confession, made in 2003, just weeks before Frank died. In these recordings, Frank Hansen tells a story that absolutely changes everything. He claims he purchased the specimen in 1967 from a military contact, a pilot who told him the body had been recovered from a crashed cargo plane in the jungles of Vietnam. According to this pilot, the creature had been killed by soldiers who found it near their base camp and, not knowing what else to do with it, packed it in ice and shipped it back to the States as part of a cargo manifest listed simply as unknown primate specimen. Hansen claimed he displayed the real body for just over a year before federal agents visited him in early 1969. These agents, who Hansen said carried credentials from an agency he didn't recognize, told him the specimen was now government property and needed to be surrendered. When Hansen protested, citing his purchase agreement and the money he had invested, they allegedly threatened him with prosecution for possessing stolen military property. Imagine having the discovery of the century and being forced to hand it over under threat of prison. According to the deathbed confession, Hansen was given 48 hours to have a replica made by a Hollywood special effects company. He did exactly that, commissioning a latex model that looked similar enough to fool casual observers, but would obviously be fake to any scientist who examined it closely. The real specimen was picked up by federal agents in an unmarked refrigerated truck and was never seen publicly again. Hansen claimed he was paid $50,000 as compensation, but was required to sign documents swearing he would never discuss what really happened. Some skeptics argued that the deathbed confession was simply an old man trying to restore his legacy, embellishing a carnival hoax into something more dramatic. Others point out that the scientists who examined the original never got to touch it or take samples, so they could have been fooled by a very good fake. But think about this logically. Why would the FBI and Smithsonian get involved if it was obviously a prop? And why would Hansen create an elaborate deathbed confession if he was just covering up a decades-old scam? What makes this case extremely creepy is what cryptozoologists discovered when they started digging into Hansen's military background. Records show he did serve as a pilot and had connections to classified cargo operations during the Vietnam War. Multiple pilots from that era have since come forward, speaking anonymously, claiming they heard stories about unusual specimens being transported out of Southeast Asia during the war, though absolutely no official documentation exists. To this day, the government has never confirmed or denied Hansen's story, and no one knows what happened to the original specimen if it was real. So, what was really encased in that block of ice in 1968? Was it an unknown hominid species killed in Vietnam and secretly transported to the United States? Or was it an elaborate hoax that fooled even experienced scientists? And if Hansen's confession was true, where is that specimen now? Stored in some classified facility, destroyed, or still frozen somewhere, waiting for the day when the truth can finally be told? A thought that is as fascinating as it is absolutely mind-blowing. In a remote section of Oregon's Cascade Mountains, there's an unmarked ravine that local Native American tribes have long warned people to avoid. They call it Genocide Creek, though that name appears on no official maps. In 2013, two experienced backcountry hunters ignored these warnings and ventured into the area during elk season. What they found at the bottom of the ravine made them immediately contact both tribal authorities and the FBI. Scattered throughout the creek bed were dozens, possibly hundreds of skeletal remains. But these weren't human, and they weren't any known animal. The bones showed a systematic pattern of trauma, suggesting a mass killing event. The hunters took photographs and collected a few small bone samples before leaving in terror. When FBI investigators arrived at the site weeks later, they found absolutely nothing. The entire ravine had been excavated, every bone removed, and the creek bed showed signs of recent heavy equipment operation. The tribal elders told investigators that this kind of cleanup has happened before, that there are groups who work to ensure certain discoveries never reach the public, quantify what they were seeing. On October 9, 2013, they were tracking elk in the Umpqua National Forest when they explored a ravine they'd never entered before. Local tribes, particularly the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua, had maintained this ravine was forbidden ground where the forest people had been massacred generations ago. The Garretts assumed these were just folklore. Pretty fascinating that they would soon discover these weren't myths at all, right? When the brothers descended into the ravine, they immediately noticed an overwhelming smell of decay. As they pushed through undergrowth along the creek bed, they started seeing bones everywhere, protruding from banks, half buried in gravel, wedged between rocks. But these weren't elk or bear bones. The skulls were massive, roughly twice the size of human skulls, with pronounced brow ridges and sagittal crests. The long bones suggested bipedal creatures standing 8 to 9 feet tall. But here's what really froze their blood cold. Nearly every skull showed catastrophic damage, fractures consistent with blunt force trauma or gunshot wounds. Rib cages were shattered, limbs showed defensive fractures. This wasn't natural death. This was systematic killing. David Garrett, a former Army combat medic, immediately recognized the pattern. He'd seen mass casualty sites in Iraq, and this looked exactly like a massacre. The brothers estimated remains from at least 50 to 70 individuals. Terrified but understanding the significance, they spent 45 minutes documenting everything with photographs and video, collecting 3 small bone fragments, including a skull piece with clear bullet hole trauma. Then they marked GPS coordinates and hiked out. Their first call was to the Cow Creek Tribal Council. Tribal elder William McCovey examined their photographs and his face went pale. "You found the killing ground. We thought all the bones had been removed years ago." He explained that tribal oral history spoke of multiple cleanup operations over the past century, times when outsiders removed evidence of what they called the Forest People Genocide. McCovey advised them to contact federal authorities. On October 11th, the Garretts met with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Torres, providing photographs, GPS coordinates, and bone samples. But here's where this case takes an extremely creepy turn. The FBI team didn't reach the ravine until October 28th, 17 days later, citing logistical complications and weather delays. When investigators finally arrived, the site had been completely transformed. The entire creek bed had been excavated to at least 6 feet depth. Fresh earth covered the area. Not a single bone remained. Heavy equipment tracks were clearly visible. Think about this. The site was in extremely remote terrain, accessible only by hiking miles through dense forest. How could someone move heavy equipment there, conduct a massive excavation, and remove tons of material without anyone noticing? Agent Torres's official report states the location showed clear evidence of recent large-scale earth-moving operations inconsistent with natural processes. The bone samples sent to Quantico were lost in processing. Pretty convenient, right? The Garretts' photographs remain in their possession, and multiple anthropologists who've examined them off the record confirm the bones don't match any known North American species. Tribal elder William McCovey, before his death in 2017, stated that Genocide Creek was just one of several massacre locations throughout the Pacific Northwest. He claimed that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were systematic efforts to eliminate what settlers called wild men, or forest devils. According to McCovey, these weren't legends but memories of actual genocide. So, what really happened at Genocide Creek? Were dozens of unknown hominids systematically killed and buried in that ravine? And who has the resources to mobilize heavy equipment into remote wilderness, excavate an entire ravine, and remove all evidence within 17 days? Think about the implications. If cleanup operations like this have happened multiple times, how many other mass graves exist in North American forests? A thought that is as terrifying as it is absolutely mind-blowing. Dr. Sarah Chen was a molecular biologist at the University of Montana who, in 2021, was analyzing DNA from hair samples collected by Bigfoot researchers across the Pacific Northwest. Her work was purely scientific curiosity, nothing she ever intended to publish. But when her preliminary results started showing genetic sequences that didn't match any known primate, she realized she might be on the verge of proving something extraordinary. She documented everything meticulously, kept backup samples in multiple locations, and was preparing a comprehensive analysis. Then, in January of 2022, her laboratory was broken into. Nothing was stolen except her samples and all of her research data. But here's what makes this case absolutely terrifying. The break-in was caught on security cameras, and the footage shows individuals wearing professional hazmat suits, using sophisticated equipment to locate and remove every trace of her work. These weren't common thieves. This was a professional operation. When Dr. Chen tried to recover her backup samples from a colleague's facility, she found those had been taken as well. Someone knew exactly where everything was stored. To this day, she refuses to work on anything related to unknown primate DNA. Dr. Chen held a PhD in molecular biology from Stanford and had spent 8 years at the University of Montana conducting genetic research. Her specialty was using environmental DNA to track animal species, analyzing hair, skin cells, and biological material left in the wild. This wasn't some amateur. This was a highly respected scientist with access to sophisticated genetic sequencing equipment. In spring 2021, a cryptozoology organization paid Dr. Chen to analyze 47 hair samples from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. She began analysis in June, expecting most would be bears, elk, or contamination. The first 20 samples were exactly that. But sample 23, collected near Mount Rainier, sent chills down her spine. The DNA showed primate markers from something in the great ape family, but the genetic sequence didn't match anything in GenBank or specialized primate databases. She ran tests again, same results. By September, she'd identified 7 samples containing DNA from an unknown primate species. The genetic markers suggested something approximately 98.6% similar to human DNA, closer than gorillas or orangutans, with distinct differences in gene regions related to skeletal structure, muscle development, and cold adaptation. When she compared sequences from samples collected hundreds of miles apart, they showed genetic variations consistent with the breeding population. This wasn't contamination. This was genetic evidence of an actual species with population diversity across the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Chen documented everything meticulously, storing data on multiple hard drives and keeping samples in a locked freezer. She also created backup samples at Montana State University in Bozeman, 90 miles away. She was preparing a paper that would represent one of the most significant zoological discoveries in modern history. Then, on January 14, 2022, at 2:47 a.m., 3 individuals in full hazmat suits entered her building through a service entrance requiring keycard access. Security footage shows them moving directly to her laboratory using handheld, scanning devices to locate samples and data storage. They systematically removed every hard drive, USB stick, and document related to her research. They opened her freezer, removed all hair samples, and used UV scanners to check for remaining biological material. The operation took 18 minutes. Pretty insane that they knew exactly what to take and where to find it, right? When investigators checked keycard access logs, they found the entrance was opened using a card registered to a maintenance employee who had died 3 months earlier. Dr. Chen immediately drove to Bozeman to retrieve backup samples. When she arrived, those samples had also vanished from her colleague's freezer, but security footage showed no unauthorized entry. Whoever took Dr. Chen's samples knew where her backups were stored and had access to a completely separate university facility. What makes this case particularly disturbing? Dr. Chen received multiple anonymous calls warning her to drop this line of research permanently. The cryptozoology organization was visited by individuals claiming to be federal agents who confiscated all remaining samples. Every journal she approached rejected her paper with terse responses, stating the material was not suitable for publication. One editor admitted off the record they'd received calls from someone representing a government agency, asking them not to publish anything related to her research. To this day, Dr. Chin continues at the University of Montana, but completely avoids research involving unknown primate DNA. When asked about the break-in, she says, "I was warned that some discoveries attract dangerous attention. I should have listened." The fear in her eyes is absolutely genuine. So what really happened? Did Dr. Chen discover genetic proof of an unknown primate species? Who has the resources to conduct coordinated operations across multiple university facilities, steal specific research materials, and intimidate scientists into silence? And how many other scientists have made similar discoveries and been silenced before they could share their findings? A thought that is as chilling as it is mind-blowing. Justin Malone was an experienced outdoorsman from Idaho who frequently posted on online forums about his wilderness expeditions. In October of 2018, he made a post that would be his last. He claimed to have discovered what he believed to be a Bigfoot burial site in the Clearwater National Forest, complete with multiple skeletal remains in various stages of decomposition. He posted photographs that showed massive bones, clearly from something bipedal, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. He stated he was collecting samples and would be bringing them to a university for analysis. Justin Malone was reported missing 3 days later when he failed to return from his trip. Search parties found his campsite completely destroyed, his vehicle burned, and his camera equipment smashed. His body was never found. But here's the detail that makes investigators believe something far more sinister than a wilderness accident occurred. His online posts, all of them, were systematically deleted from every forum he'd ever used. The photographs he'd uploaded were scrubbed from servers, and multiple people who had communicated with him reported receiving threatening messages warning them not to discuss what he'd found. And this is nothing compared to what you're about to see. Justin Malone was a 34-year-old wilderness guide from Boise who had explored the Pacific Northwest backcountry for 15 years. He was a respected member of outdoor adventure forums, known for detailed trip reports, accurate GPS coordinates, and honest terrain assessments. This wasn't some random person making wild claims. This was someone whose word meant something in the outdoor community. On October 7th, 2018, at 9:30 p.m., Justin posted on backcountryexplorers.com with the title, "You Won't Believe What I Found in Clearwater, NF." He described hiking off trail 18 miles from the nearest road when he discovered what appeared to be a deliberate burial ground containing multiple skeletal remains. He uploaded 14 photographs showing massive bones partially buried and arranged in intentional patterns. The images showed skulls far larger than human skulls, with pronounced sagittal crests and forward-positioned eye sockets. Long bones suggested bipedal creatures of enormous size, with hand bones showing clear opposable thumbs. Justin counted remains from at least 8 individuals, ranging from juveniles to fully grown adults. This was evidence of a family group or community. In his post, Justin wrote, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm looking at bones that don't match any known species. I've collected 3 small samples for the University of Idaho. If these are what I think they are, this is going to change everything. Heading out tomorrow morning." Within 2 hours, over 200 forum members had viewed it. Justin never made another post. His girlfriend Emily Richardson reported him missing on October 11th. Search teams found his campsite completely destroyed on October 13th. His tent was shredded, equipment scattered and crushed. But here's what makes it clear this wasn't a bear attack. His Toyota Tacoma, parked 3 miles away, had been deliberately set on fire with accelerant. Inside were melted remains of his laptop, hard drives, and camera equipment, all smashed before being burned. Search teams found no trace of Justin, no blood evidence, no indication of injury. He simply vanished. Multiple forum members who'd communicated with Justin received anonymous threatening messages. One received an email stating, "Forget what Justin Malone showed you. If you value your safety, you will not discuss this further." Then Justin's original post was deleted. Not just the post, but his entire account. Forum administrators were mystified because server logs showed deletion from an external source with administrative access that shouldn't have been possible. Within 48 hours, every post Justin had made on multiple forums over 6 years was systematically erased. His social media accounts were deactivated. His website went offline. Several forum members had downloaded his photographs. 2 agreed to be interviewed, and provided copies. Both reported being contacted by individuals claiming to be federal agents who demanded they turn over photographs and sign non-disclosure agreements. One was explicitly told that discussing or distributing the images would result in prosecution under the Espionage Act. Think about how absurd that sounds. The burial site Justin described has never been located. Despite his GPS coordinates and terrain descriptions, no one has found any matching site. Emily Richardson maintains Justin was killed because he found something he wasn't supposed to find. In 2020, one forum member anonymously released Justin's photographs to a cryptozoology website. The images show exactly what Justin described: massive skeletal remains that don't match any known species. Multiple forensic anthropologists confirmed the bones are consistent with a large bipedal primate, but far too large to be human, and don't match any great ape species. So, what really happened to Justin Malone? Did he discover a burial site proving an unknown species exists? And was he killed to keep that secret? Who can systematically delete someone's entire online presence across multiple platforms? And how many other people have stumbled upon similar discoveries in remote wilderness and simply never came home? A thought that is as disturbing as it is mind-blowing. This is the case that, if true, proves that everything we've been told about human evolution, about what species exist on this planet, has been a carefully maintained lie. In 2023, a soil sample collected from Crittenden Creek in Northern California was submitted to a commercial DNA analysis laboratory by a researcher who had no idea what it would reveal. The soil came from an area where multiple Bigfoot sightings had been reported, and the researcher was simply hoping to find hair or skin cells that might prove interesting. What the DNA sequencing revealed was absolutely world-shattering. The sample contained genetic material from an unknown primate species that showed 99.2% similarity to human DNA, closer than chimpanzees, closer than any known extinct hominid. But here's what makes this case different from all the others. The researcher, knowing the significance, immediately uploaded the complete genetic sequence to a public database before anyone could stop him. For 48 hours, scientists around the world examined the data and confirmed it was legitimate. Then the sequence was removed. The researcher's account was terminated, and when reporters tried to follow up, they found that the man who submitted it had vanished completely. His home was emptied, his phone disconnected, his employment records scrubbed. It was as if he never existed. But dozens of scientists downloaded that genetic data during those 48 hours. They have it. They've studied it. And some of them, speaking anonymously, confirm that the DNA is real, unexplainable, and proves that there is an unknown intelligent primate species living in North America right now. A thought that is as fascinating as it is absolutely terrifying. The researcher was identified as Dr. James Markham, a wildlife geneticist working as an independent consultant after leaving academia in 2020. Markham had become fascinated with environmental DNA sampling, a technique where scientists collect soil or water samples to identify what species have been in an area based on shed cells, hair, or biological material. This is cutting-edge, legitimate, peer-reviewed methodology used by researchers worldwide. In March 2023, Markham traveled to Crittenden Creek in Humboldt County, California, a region with a long history of Bigfoot sightings. He collected soil samples from locations where witnesses had reported seeing large bipedal creatures, then submitted them to Genome-Seq, a commercial company specializing in environmental DNA analysis. The results came back on April 3rd, and what they found sent chills through the laboratory staff. The soil contained DNA from multiple known species, but also genetic sequences from something completely unknown. The DNA showed clear primate markers, specifically great ape characteristics, but the chromosomal structure was remarkably similar to human DNA. The comparison analysis results were staggering: 99.2% genetic similarity to Homo sapiens. To put that in perspective, humans share approximately 98.8% DNA with chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. This unknown DNA was closer to human than chimps are. But here's what really froze everyone's blood cold. The genetic differences weren't random mutations. They were structured variations in specific gene clusters related to cold adaptation, increased muscle mass, enhanced night vision, and skeletal density. This wasn't contamination or degraded human DNA. This was evidence of a distinct species that had evolved alongside humans, but adapted to completely different environmental pressures. Dr. Markham understood immediately he'd discovered something extraordinary, but he also understood, based on cases of suppressed research and disappeared evidence, that going through normal channels would bury his findings. So, on April 5th at 11 p.m., he did something brilliant and incredibly dangerous. He uploaded the complete genetic sequence to GenBank, the public genetic database maintained by the National Institutes of Health, and simultaneously posted it to open-source genetic research forums including AIRChurv and ResearchGate. Markham's data was public for 48 hours before removal. During that window, hundreds of geneticists, molecular biologists, and anthropologists worldwide downloaded the sequence and began analyzing it. Multiple researchers, speaking anonymously, have confirmed the data is legitimate, unexplainable by contamination or known species, and represents something that should not exist according to the current evolutionary biology. One MIT geneticist, speaking anonymously, stated, "I've studied primate genetics for 23 years. I've sequenced DNA from every known great ape species. What Markham uploaded was real, properly formatted genetic data, showing a complete mitochondrial genome and partial nuclear DNA from something that's 99.2% human, but distinctly not human. The variations are too structured to be mutation or degradation. This is a separate species." On April 8th, exactly 72 hours after upload, the genetic sequences were removed from all public databases. Markham's accounts were terminated. His posts were deleted. Within 24 hours, Dr. James Markham completely vanished. His Sacramento apartment was found empty, professionally cleaned with no trace anyone had lived there. His phone was disconnected, email accounts closed, social media profiles disappeared. His employment records at his previous university were scrubbed. His published papers were still attributed to J. Markham, but with no contact information. Someone had systematically erased every trace of his existence while leaving just enough evidence to prove he'd once been real. Multiple people who'd communicated with Markham received visits from individuals claiming to be federal agents demanding copies of his genetic data and requiring non-disclosure agreements. One UC Berkeley molecular biology professor, who refused to sign, reported being threatened with prosecution for possessing classified genetic information. But dozens of scientists downloaded and kept copies of Markham's data. Some have continued analyzing it in secret. The DNA doesn't just show a species closely related to humans. It shows a species that diverged from the human lineage approximately 250,000 years ago, but has been evolving separately ever since. The genetic markers suggest a population adapted to mountainous, forested environments with extraordinary physical capabilities but retained cognitive development genes that make humans intelligent. One cryptozoologist had the data analyzed by 3 independent genetic laboratories, each believing they were examining samples from a remote human population. All 3 confirmed DNA from primates with 99.2% human similarity, but with distinct variations not matching any known ethnic group or extinct hominid. When told the DNA came from soil samples, all 3 expressed absolute bafflement. To this day, no official statement has been made about the Crittenden Creek DNA sequence. The National Institutes of Health stated only that the sequence was removed due to data quality concerns, but refuses further details. GenomeSeek went out of business in August 2023, just 4 months later, citing unforeseen regulatory complications. What makes this case ultimate proof that something's being hidden? Those downloaded genetic sequences exist. Being studied in secret by scientists who understand publishing would end their careers or worse. When compared to other mysterious DNA samples collected over years, they are finding genetic matches. This suggests a breeding population, an actual species with genetic diversity and regional variations. So, what does the Crittenden Creek DNA really prove? That there's an unknown primate species in North America with 99.2% genetic similarity to humans. And here's the ultimate question tying together every case we've discussed. If this DNA is real, if all these bone discoveries are genuine, if researchers are being silenced and evidence destroyed, who is coordinating this massive cover-up? What organization can erase genetic data from public databases, make people disappear, intimidate scientists at major universities, and suppress discoveries across multiple countries for decades? Think about everything we've covered. 15 cases of bones being found and disappearing, DNA results destroyed, researchers vanishing or dying under suspicious circumstances, federal agents threatening people with the Espionage Act, military installations allegedly storing unknown primate remains, systematic erasure of evidence from mass grave sites, and now, genetic proof briefly public before being scrubbed with the researcher erased from existence. Are we really supposed to believe all of this is coincidence? Or is the truth exactly what the evidence suggests? That there is an unknown intelligent species sharing this continent with us, that some organization has known for decades or centuries, and that they will go to any lengths, including making people disappear, to keep that knowledge from the public. And if that's true, what else are they hiding? What other discoveries have been suppressed? What other truths are we not being told? A thought that is as terrifying as it is absolutely mind-blowing.